Behind me now is the second Sunshine Church, which has stood outside of the community of Round Oak, Georgia, the first one having been burned down by federal troops as they marched to the sea in November of 1864. Now, regardless of what many Georgians will tell you about Sherman's march to the sea, they left most churches and hospitals untouched. However, federal troops here discovered the bodies of several of their comrades being picked apart by wild hogs after a battle months prior, and they had gone unburied. So, incensed, they burned the church down. And this is the modern-day Sunshine Church. You can see that the Stoneman raid followed the rail tracks, because, of course, these aren't the original rail tracks, but they're built right over the old ones, and these would have supplied materials from Macon to Atlanta, which was besieged by the Union Army at the time. And of course, if you're able to break that siege, then you were able to take the city of Atlanta, and Georgia would follow soon after. Now, if you rewind to July 27, 1864, a Brigadier General, Stoneman, had requested of Sherman to go and sever railroad ties down in Macon with his 2,100-man force and to possibly liberate Andersonville Prison and possibly even use those troops to attack Confederate positions on their way back up to Atlanta. And Sherman, not wanting the siege on Atlanta to last any longer than it needed to, and not even wanting to burn Atlanta to the ground at that point, actually agreed to this, but they made it down and found it impossible to cross certain rivers, so they burned the bridge on the Oconee, they destroyed the rails in Macon, and by that point they had been on horseback for 3 days. It was the 30th, and they were all exhausted. And it was about then that they started hearing rumors of a large Confederate cavalry force up near the town of Clinton, and they didn't really think anything of it. But a native in the Confederate Army, actually assembled 1,300 men here and met the Union forces as they marched north. And what followed was a skirmish at which both of them dismounted, but the Union troops, being exhausted, they quickly surrendered, many of them, about 400 right near Stoneman's Hill. Just a few miles south on this road is Clinton, Georgia, which was the birthplace of General Iverson, who countered and conquered Stoneman's raid here. His troops would have actually lined up right along the old Pippin Road, which existed back in the day, except the road went from about a quarter mile in that direction where the troops began and stretched over to the opposite side of the tracks. Stoneman's troops would have been assembled a little bit further down the road, closer to Clinton, and Stoneman himself surrendered a little bit over to the left near Stoneman's Hill. And the Brigadier General to counter Stoneman's forces on this hill was Confederate General Alfred Iverson Jr., who actually grew up just a few miles away in Clinton, Georgia. And it's interesting to think of him hearing the news of this raid blazing through the countryside, not knowing where it would appear next, but knowing that he was right along the railroads, he decided to set up makeshift fortifications. And imagine his elation when he actually captured Stoneman's forces, and then imagine a few months later his sadness when this battle, which was, of course, in his favor, finally ended in anger and frustration from federal troops, which saw that his men didn't bury all the bodies of the Union men that had died here. And here we are atop Stoneman's Hill now, where Brigadier General Stoneman made his last stand before being taken prisoner by the Confederate States. The battle kind of started commencing on this main road, which would have existed at the time kind of parallel to the railroad, and his men were quickly defeated. About 800 of them were able to escape and make it back to Atlanta, and 400 immediately were captured in the woods right around here. Stoneman himself actually surrendered to Confederate forces and ordered his men, or the men that remained with him, to surrender about a quarter mile in the woods down there, close to the creek. And ironically, a lot of these men ended up in Andersonville, which they were trying to liberate, kind of forcing Sherman's hand at his brutality towards Atlanta and making a public acceptance, at least in the Union, of the march to the sea. And the battle itself was just hacking and slashing because they all drew their swords. They were all cavalry, and they were whacking at each other in the street, shouting, "Surrender, surrender, damn you." But eventually, after wave of attack, the Union troops threw their hands up and Stoneman surrendered 400, and of the 2,100 that had come down here, only 800 made it back to Sherman, and Sherman decided from then on to besiege Atlanta and finally blaze his path to the sea. And when he discovered the bodies of several of the men that were killed in this battle had gone unburied and were being eaten by hogs, of course his troops did what they did and burned the first church down.